When the first full trailer for Star Trek Picard was released ahead of the premiere of its first season in January of 2020, Trekkies were surprised and intrigued by the appearance of one particular character, Seven of Nine, played once again by Jeri Ryan. It was surprising because the Picard show had been pitched as definitely not a nostalgia show. Yes, Patrick Stewart was returning as Jean-Luc Picard, and yes, Brent Spiner was playing Data again, somehow, but in interviews and across social media, Stewart and the creators of the series made it clear that it would not be Star Trek The Next Generation Season 8. Picard himself was the only legacy character in the regular cast, and the plot would send the elderly former captain of the Enterprise on a whole new adventure. So, what was Seven of Nine, who, like Jean-Luc Picard and Data, was a legacy character, but from an entirely different series, doing on Star Trek Picard? It was intriguing because, after you thought about it for a minute, it kind of made sense. Picard and Seven had never interacted on screen before, but they shared at least one very important experience in common. They were both former Borg. Picard was briefly assimilated during the legendary TNG two-parter, The Best of Both Worlds, an experience that was revisited during the film Star Trek First Contact, and Seven was introduced as a regular of Star Trek Voyager beginning in that show's fourth season as a Borg drone who was rescued by the Voyager crew and allowed to rediscover her individuality. There seemed to be potential for Seven to be included in the story of the Picard series in an interesting way. Whatever that story turned out to be. How did it turn out? Well, a clue to my opinion on the subject can be found in the title of this video, which is Why Seven of Nine Actually Deserved Better. Before we dig into Seven's characterization in the Picard series, let's back up. Seven joined Star Trek Voyager almost halfway through that show's 7-year run, and almost immediately became a breakout character. She had been added to the cast in a blatant attempt to boost the show's sex appeal, but a combination of sharp writing, atypical for Voyager, and an intelligent and multifaceted performance by Jeri Ryan turned Seven into a genuinely compelling character, and one of the few on Voyager to actually have an arc. That arc mostly involved Seven's struggles to leave her life as a member of the Borg collective behind and rediscover her individuality and her humanity. It provided the basis for some of the better episodes of Voyager's later seasons, but it also left Seven without an obvious path forward when Voyager ended. Hypothetically speaking, the series was over, so there was no path forward for any of the Voyager characters, but if you wanted to imagine what would happen to them next, what direction their lives would take after the ship finally returned home to Earth after having been lost on the far side of the galaxy for 7 years, you at least had some idea. The Starfleet crew would presumably continue their Starfleet careers, maybe get promoted. We live in hope, don't we, Harry? Tom and B'Elanna would adjust to being first-time parents, but Seven's prospects weren't nearly so clear-cut. She wasn't a member of Starfleet. It was never a foregone conclusion that she would want to join Starfleet if and when Voyager returned home. She was obviously going to break up with Chakotay in a matter of weeks, if not days, but other than that, her future seemed wide open and impossible to predict. That's one of the reasons her reappearance as a recurring character on Star Trek Picard held such promise and generated such interest. It had been almost 20 years since we'd seen her. Judging by her brief appearance in the Picard trailer, she seemed different than we remembered. Where had she been? What had she done? Who was she now? We begin to learn the answers to those questions in Episode 5 of Star Trek Picard's first season. Seven's first appearance technically comes in the previous episode, but she doesn't show up until the closing moments and says only a single line, "You owe me a ship, Picard." Her ship had just been destroyed while helping Picard and his new crew aboard La Sirena fight off a Romulan ship. That's the end of Episode 4. At the beginning of Episode 5, we get a brief, bloody glimpse of what Seven has been up to since the events of Voyager's final episode. We meet Icheb. Yes, that Icheb. Remember Icheb from Voyager? Was he one of your faves? Are you happy to see him again? Don't get attached. In this opening flashback to 13 years before the present day of the Picard series, we find Icheb captured by criminals who are stripping him for his Borg parts. Seven bursts into the rescue, uses her phaser to take out all the crooks, then rushes to the table like, "Icheb, is that you?" "Aye, aye." Wait, scratch that second one. Poor Icheb is in a real bad way. There's apparently no saving him. So, with his tearful assent, Seven, also crying, old yellers him. Who would have thought that her time on Voyager would turn out to be the good old days? Jesus! Returning to the present aboard La Sirena, Seven and Picard have a scene where they discuss the fact that Seven works for the Fenris Rangers, an unsanctioned vigilante group that attempts to maintain order in a lawless region of space. Seven has apparently been a ranger for most of her post-Voyager life, doing what she can to help people who reside outside the reach or interest of the Federation. It's an interesting place to pick things up with her, mostly for how unexpected it is. I like it a lot, at least in concept. When the Picard series started, I remember some fans whining about how Jean-Luc Picard was retired and living on his estate running the family vineyard. He should be the president of the Federation, a lot of discontented Trekkies said. And sure, the longer the Picard series went on, the more generously it furnished us with actual things to complain about, but Picard's starting point was never one of them. President of the Federation? Is there a more boring, obvious, unimaginative path his character arc could have taken? Granted, retired and making wine isn't exactly out of the box, since it's more or less where he was in the possible future depicted in the final episode of TNG way back in 1994, but Christ, it's better than President of the Federation. Likewise, we don't pick up Seven of Nine to find her, I don't know, commanding a science vessel, or working with Admiral Janeway on some project to adapt Borg technology for use with Starfleet ships, or living on a commune with a group of ex-Borg and teaching them how to exist as individuals, while also participating voluntarily in society, or being the captain of the Enterprise, or any other Tumblr fanfic bullshit. We find her doing something new, something we probably wouldn't have guessed she'd be doing based on what we'd seen of her before, but something that feels like it fits with who she is. Seven spending her time fighting the good fight, but outside the structures of the Federation or Starfleet makes sense. On Voyager, she was frequently the one who saw what the right thing to do was and wound up butting heads with someone else, usually Janeway, who told her she had to play by the rules, to do the right thing, but in the right way. Seven was able to function within that system eventually, but she never seemed totally comfortable with it. Seeing her operating outside of established systems and institutions, in an area where systems and institutions like that don't seem to exist, as a Fenris Ranger, seems natural, even though we couldn't have predicted it for her. Also, a big reason why we couldn't have predicted it for her is that Fenris Rangers weren't a thing yet. The writers of Star Trek Picard made them up for their show. Creators of a Star Trek show, creating new Star Trek shit and using it to forward the story of an established character instead of just showing us that character doing some variation of what they were doing 30 years ago. Wild, right? The Picard series isn't always that inventive, even in the first season, and a lot of what Seven winds up doing in season 1 feels like bringing up old business. Oh, there's going to be Borg stuff? You know who'd be good for that? And sometimes even the new stuff they give Seven is severely undercooked. Oh, hey, are Seven and Raffi like a thing now? That's cool. Couldn't you have, I don't know, made that part of the show instead of just throwing it out there as an element in one of the final shots of the season? But overall, Star Trek Picard does a fair job of reintroducing Seven and treating her like a character rather than an action figure. In season 1. Then the series continues for 2 more seasons, and Jesus. Okay. Seven does make out a lot better than some of her fellow Star Trek Picard characters. At least in season 2, Jerry Ryan does actually get to play Seven and not an entirely different character who just happens to look exactly like her, which was the case for not 1, not 2, but 3 of her castmates. What was I saying just now about the Picard series not always being very inventive? There you go. Season 2 also mercifully keeps Seven removed from the Borg-related stuff. The writers of the series are not sufficiently merciful to just not do any more Borg-related stuff in the first place, but this time the Borg stuff mostly winds up centering on Jurati, which sucks for her since she finds herself at the center of some of the most brainless, cribbed from a middle schooler's AO3 profile, cringe-inducingly bad material of this, the single worst season of Star Trek yet produced. But this video isn't about Jurati. It's about Seven, and while I wouldn't say Seven is used well in Season 2 of Picard, at least she's not stuck doing whatever any of this was supposed to be. Instead, Seven spends most of the season in an approximation of a buddy comedy with Raffi, which sounds like a good idea on paper, right? Seven and Raffi are just kind of randomly together at the very end of Season 1, so now we can actually see them as a couple and a team and get a better idea of what they are like. Only that never really happens. When the season begins, Seven and Raffi are separated. Physically separated, yes, but also in terms of their relationship. They're not quite broken up, but not quite together. And they stay that way for most of the season. So why have them get together at the end of the first season at all? I realize that this shit was probably not planned ahead, but in hindsight, wouldn't it have made more sense to not have Seven and Raffi suddenly holding hands and seeming all lovey-dovey at the end of Season 1 and make them falling in love as they have their adventure together in the 21st century, part of their story in Season 2? I feel like that's kind of what they tried to do anyway. Hence having them not really being together at the start of the season. But it, like everything else in Season 2, just doesn't work. Seven and Raffi never really have much chemistry together. They bicker a lot, but not in a way that imparts any romantic or sexual tension to their scenes together. And it doesn't help that their scenes together are among the most absurdly uneventful scenes of the season. I know I've referred to this a few times before as an example of the sort of writing that makes Season 2 of Picard so dreadful, but there's an episode where Seven and Raffi spend most of an episode standing around in an alley trying to figure out what to do. They track Borg Jurati to the alley, Borg Jurati fights them and gets away, and then Seven and Raffi just sort of loiter for a bit, like, well, what now? We cut away from them doing nothing, cut back to them in the same place, still doing nothing, cut away, cut back, same place, still nothing. Riveting. Seven and Raffi also get to have the most pointless car chase in the history of television. They're pursuing nothing, being chased by no one, they go nowhere, and they get out of it by having someone else come to their rescue. It doesn't help that the script can't decide which member of the odd couple each of them is supposed to be at any given time. Even in her more relaxed post-Voyager phase, Seven seems like an obvious choice to be the Felix, while Raffi, I mean, she's an Oscar if I've ever seen one. But that's beside the point. If they wanted Seven to be the Oscar and Raffi to be the Felix, that's fine. Just pick an arrangement and try to at least keep it straight within a single scene, huh? We can't have people flipping between Felix and Oscar willy-nilly. After that, can extinction be far behind? For most of Season 2, Seven is just along for the ride. She's there, and she does stuff that serves the plot, such as it is, but not much beyond that. There is a brief flirtation with something potentially interesting in the early going when Seven wakes up in the alternate reality that occurs for reasons which I don't think even the writers of the show understand. She realizes right away that this reality's version of her was never assimilated by the Borg. She has no Borg implants on her face. When she beams down to Earth, in the 21st century, for the first time, she encounters a little girl who has no reason to fear her. A little girl who, having just seen her materialize out of thin air, looks at her like a superhero. Now, in the sort of TV show where the things that happened meant something and characters had arcs, this would be important and potentially lead somewhere. Seven is having a new experience. She doesn't feel like an outcast or a monster. When people look at her, they don't see a threat or someone who needs to be fixed. Perhaps Seven's story, as the season continues, will return to this theme. Perhaps Seven will start to like the feeling of being this alternate version of herself and will begin to feel conflicted about putting history back the way it was. Hey, maybe Seven will even consider staying behind in this century as this version of herself instead of returning to the future with her friends. There are all sorts of ways this could go to make Seven's part in the show meaningful and compelling if Star Trek Picard was that kind of show, which it's not. So instead, Seven doesn't really have much of an arc at all. Her participation in the plot is fairly generic and could have been handled by any of the other characters without necessitating any major changes to the script beyond search and replacing the names. And ultimately, it's Captain Rios who decides he wants to remain behind in the 21st century because he met a girl and he thinks the cigars and peanut butter are better than back home. You know what? Maybe Seven wasn't overlooked by the writing of Season 2. Maybe she was hiding from it. Smart move. Come Season 3 of Star Trek Picard, there was nowhere to hide, though, because the writers of Season 3 had big ideas for Seven of Nine. Bold, creative ideas to push her character in exciting new directions. Brilliantly imaginative ideas like, she's in Starfleet now, I guess? And she's a commander and the first officer of the Titan, which is the hero ship for the third season? Okay. The first episode of Picard Season 3 is one of the worst episodes of Star Trek I've ever seen, and Seven's character arc essentially being rebooted is near the bottom of the list of shit that's wrong with it. So I guess there's that, at least. Seven's part isn't as bad as most of the rest of the show. Season 3 of Picard gets better after that first episode. It would almost have to, peaking with an outstanding fourth episode before eventually just falling off a cliff at the end. One of the relative bright spots in the season does turn out to be Seven. She doesn't really have a character arc, but she does have a story primarily defined by her relationship with her commanding officer aboard the Titan, Captain Shaw. While serving under his command, Captain Shaw requires Seven to go by her birth name, Annika Hansen. This would not be Seven's choice. She was assimilated by the Borg as a young child, and even though she's now been de-assimilated for longer than she was a Borg drone, she still thinks of herself as Seven, not Annika. Shaw doesn't care, though, as a no-nonsense, by-the-book captain and survivor of the Borg's destruction of the Federation fleet at Wolf 359 back when Picard was assimilated. Shaw doesn't particularly care by which name his former Borg first officer prefers to be known. As far as he's concerned, she's Commander Hansen, and that's how he wants her to be addressed. Shaw's refusal to call Seven by her right name is an act of fundamental disrespect, but Seven endures it for some reason. I don't know. She really wants to be in Starfleet all of a sudden? To the point that she's willing to put up with this asshole dead-naming her and having all her subordinates on the crew dead-name her as well? It doesn't really make sense with what we've seen from Seven up to this point in the Picard series, but then again, this is Season 3, where almost nothing we've seen up to this point in the series matters anyway. Besides, it's a starting point for a story that, in a rare and daring departure for this season of the show, is not merely an excuse to throw a bunch of pandering nostalgia at the screen. So I'll let it slide. As the season unfolds and circumstances require Seven to step up and demonstrate her ability to lead, as well as her intelligence and bravery, Shaw's respect for her increases. This leads to the big payoff in the second-to-last episode of the season, when Shaw, mortally wounded in a firefight with the Borg, orders Seven to take command of the ship, using her right name, Seven of Nine, moments before dying from his injuries. That's a nice moment. Redemption for Shaw, validation for Seven, and a demonstration for us in the audience of how important and meaningful it is to respect the identities of others and call them by their names, their right names, the names they want to be called by, not the names you've decided they should be called by. In that way, Seven receives two kinds of validation at the same time. In story, finally being accepted and acknowledged for who she is, receiving her due respect from her captain, and externally, as a character, showing what depth and symbolic power she possesses. It also pushes Seven forward both in terms of plot and her character development. Like I said, she doesn't really have much of an arc in Season 3, but what little arc she does have relates to her moving from being a subordinate to being a commander and how she gains the confidence to accept herself as being fit for that role. If you squint and tilt your head a bit, it even kind of fits with her portrayal from the previous seasons of Picard and her portrayal on Voyager. She leaves one hierarchy, the Borg, joins another, Voyager's crew, albeit as an unranked crew member outside the conventional command structure, eventually leaves that hierarchy behind altogether to become a Fenris Ranger operating in spaces beyond the reach of institutions like Starfleet and the Federation, then finally returns to the hierarchy of Starfleet, this time as a full-fledged member, a commissioned officer, and finds a way not only to function within that hierarchy, but rises to a position of leadership within it, commanding officer of a starship. From child to Borg drone to liberated Borg drone working with the Starfleet crew that rescued her, to vigilante in the wild west of space, to Starfleet officer, and finally to captain of the Titan. It's not the path I would have written for her, but it is a path that can be read in a way that makes sense and is consistent with who we've known Seven to be over the years. Then they had to go and fick it all up with their fan-fuck fickery. As most of you who watch my stuff even somewhat regularly know, I was not a fan of the Star Trek Picard series overall. I do think the third and final season, as shameless and pandering as it is the best season of the show, but only because the first two seasons are worse, not because season 3 is all that good, because, with the exception of a couple of episodes and a few of the performances, it's not. Despite being generally better than the first two seasons, there are particular areas where season 3 of Picard represents the show at its absolute worst. Much of the creative project of the season is dedicated to undoing the somewhat out-of-the-box elements of the earlier seasons and making the show feel more familiar and conventional. Season 1 of Picard is not good, but it has its moments, and it has some promising ideas. Seven in the Fenris Rangers is one of them. At the start of Season 2, before all the time travel shenanigans, Seven is still a Fenris Ranger, but now in command of La Sirena, since Rios has returned to Starfleet to become captain of the new USS Stargazer. Seven, being a Ranger, doesn't factor into the story of Season 2 at all, but it's a sensible and potentially interesting place for her to be in her life. Then comes Season 3, and like I said, it's not what I would have written. It does take Seven off of this fresh, unexpected path she was on and drag her in a more conventional direction, but it's fine up to a point. Then, in the final episodes, the season and the series goes full Rise of Skywalker, reveals the Borg as the true villains, brings back the Enterprise D, the one that was destroyed 30 years ago, yes, that Enterprise D, and ends with the hero ship for most of the season, the Titan, being rechristened as the new Enterprise, and Seven becoming the captain of this new Enterprise. Oh, and Raffi is Seven's first officer, and Jean-Luc Picard and Beverly Crusher's son Jack, who is also now in Starfleet, is a member of the crew too, as Captain Seven's special counselor, a position so meaningless it makes Strategic Operations Officer sound like an integral link in the chain of command. Oh, also, the helm officer of the Pander-prise is Sydney LaForge, Geordi's daughter. Anything else? Hey, how about Chief Engineer Naomi Wildman? Remember her from Voyager? Why not Science Officer Icheb? I know they killed him in Season 1 of Picard, but what if it turns out he backed up his soul onto one of his Borg implants, and they were able to transfer his consciousness to a new android body, like they did for Picard? And Data. And since we're apparently just grabbing legacy characters randomly from anywhere we feel like, maybe ship's counselor Molly O'Brien. She spent her entire life helping her father work through constant, unthinkable trauma, and now she's ready to put what she's learned into practice. Room for one more? How about, I don't know, this guy? They fixed his immune system so it won't cause other people to die of rapid onset old age, and they cut him loose from Darwin Station, and he joined Starfleet. They waived the no genetic engineering rule for him. Who fucking cares? And now he's, chief of security. Because he's got super strength, and he's fast, and super smart. He's a superhero. And he can tell when someone's thinking of starting some shit, because he's also a telepath. Security chief, this guy, from that one episode of TNG. Coming soon to Paramount Plus, Star Trek. You remember? Yeah, okay, so I'm exaggerating a little, but let's take another look at that long-term trajectory for Seven's character with the ending of Picard Season 3 included. From child to Borg drone, to rescued Borg drone working with the Starfleet crew that rescued her, to vigilante in the Wild West of space, to Starfleet officer, to captain of the Titan, which is nonsensically renamed the Enterprise and operated by a crew consisting almost entirely of legacy characters or the children of legacy characters. Fans who approved of this direction for Seven said things like, "Good for Seven," and "She deserves it. She'll make a great captain," which are the kinds of things you say when someone you like gets a promotion or an award or some other well-deserved recognition, when that someone is a real person. Seven of Nine is not a real person. She's a character on a made-up TV show. Jerry Ryan is a real person and a terrific actor, and I wish her all the success in the world. And if part of that success is getting to play Seven of Nine again, this time as the lead in a new Star Trek series, you know what? Despite my wish that Star Trek, along with everything else, would stop leaning so hard on fan service and nostalgia, in theory, I'd be up for a Seven-led Star Trek show. I'd really have been up for it after Season 1 of Picard. Have Phaser will travel? A series following Seven of Nine, a lone crusader championing the cause of the innocent, the helpless, the powerless, in a world of criminals who operate above the law? Give her a talking ship and you know what you've got. Knight Rider in space. You bet your ass I'll give that a look. But Seven of Nine fan service ranger? Captain of the starship Pander-prise? Leader of the Memberberry Brigade? I'd be hard-pressed to think of a premise for a Star Trek series I'd be less interested in, short of something completely creatively bankrupt like Enterprise Season 5, The Romulan War. Here's the thing. I'm not the sort of Trekkie who yearns for a series centered away from Starfleet. I know there are some fans who are just dying for a show about Klingons, but I couldn't give less of a shit. I love Klingons, but does the basic concept of Star Trek, oops, all Klingons excite me? Nah, not so much. However, just because I'm happy for the franchise to continue centering on characters in Starfleet, that doesn't mean every character, or at least every lead character, should have the same job or the same arc. Not everyone needs to be the captain of the Enterprise, or a captain at all. Not everyone should be. Captain of the Enterprise isn't a trophy to be given out to our favorite characters, and no one, least of all the writers of actual Star Trek shows, ought to be looking at it that way. Seven's a great character. So is Major Kira from Deep Space Nine. Should she be the captain of the Enterprise? My favorite cast member of Star Trek Discovery is Saru. He got to be captain of the Starship Discovery during that show's 3rd season, but now that the series is about to end, should the last episode end with Saru assuming command of that era's version of the Enterprise, whichever letter they'd be up to in the 32nd century? Probably multiple letters by that point. It's almost 1,000 years in the future. The Enterprise WTF? Captain Saru of the Starship Enterprise? Because he earned it for being an awesome character? Maybe the Enterprise SMH. It's not that Seven's rise to the captaincy of the Enterprise doesn't make sense within the fiction of the show. It's presented in such a way that we can understand the sequence of events that leads up to it, and it makes sense in a purely plot-based way. It's not that Seven, from what we know of her, would make a bad captain. She's incredibly smart, she's courageous, she's principled, she's authoritative, and able to command attention and respect. She's empathetic. She'd probably make a very good captain, but that's not the point. Seven's appeal lies in her status as an outsider. On Voyager and on Picard for its first 2 seasons, she stands apart from the established hierarchy. She speaks to Captain Janeway with a bluntness and, when she feels it necessary, a disregard for traditional discipline that no other character can muster, because even though she lives on Janeway's ship and is ultimately still subject to Janeway's authority, Seven's not in Starfleet. She doesn't care about being demoted or court-martialed or whatever. She speaks her mind, and she does what she thinks is necessary and right, whether it happens to be the Starfleet thing to do or not. When she reaches the Alpha Quadrant with the rest of the Voyager crew, she decides not to pursue a life in Starfleet, but instead to continue living and working in the margins, doing what she can on behalf of people who have been forgotten or abandoned or failed by the institutions of civilization. And sure, you can frame her joining Starfleet and becoming captain of the Enterprise as a continuation of that. She's bringing her outsider's mentality inside. She's using the resources of the Federation to come to the aid of those who need help but haven't gotten it. There's even a possible seed of story and character development in there somewhere. Will Seven change the system, or will the system change Seven? But for me, anyway, if you choose to take the character in that direction, you're turning away from her most compelling attributes and turning her into just another variation of almost every Star Trek lead protagonist that has come before her, the Maverick Captain. Which wouldn't necessarily be bad. It's worked before, but it's still not the ideal use of Seven's character. Back in 1997, when she joined the regular cast of Star Trek Voyager, 7 of 9 was a character with a strong starting premise and a character arc stretching out before her filled with promise, some of which was even fulfilled by the time Voyager ended its run. But when many viewers of the show looked at 7, all they saw was a fantasy object, a pretty toy. These viewers weren't interested in Seven's story. They just wanted to see her do what they wanted her to do. Today, a year after the conclusion of Season 3 of Star Trek Picard, with a certain segment of the fan base still demanding a new series picking up where Picard left off, featuring the adventures of Captain Seven, things haven't changed very much. The fantasy itself has changed. We've gone from fans daydreaming about Seven in that cat suit and high heels to fans daydreaming about Seven in the center seat on the bridge of the Enterprise. But what was true in 1997 is still true now. 7 of 9 deserved, and still deserves, better than to be the product of narrow, meager imaginations. And I know some of you are probably thinking, whatever, Steve, you're just saying all this because you're salty, you're never going to get Knight Rider in space. But that's not the only reason. Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one. I'm going to let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is going to be, but before I do that, I want to give shoutouts to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are Leonard King Jr., thanks Leonard. Robert Williams, thanks Robert. Nick, thanks Nick. Marvin Price, thanks Marvin. Debbie Bannister, thanks Debbie. Mike Halsey, thanks Mike. Rocky Wingard, thanks Rocky. Neil Kaner, thanks Neil. Kurtz, thanks Kurtz. Jamal Howard, thanks Jamal. Amy Cannon, thanks Amy. Harvest Mouse Productions, thanks Harvest Mouse Productions. Terry Boone, thanks Terry. And now for the new channel members. They are Philip O'Neill, thanks Philip. Debbie Bannister, thanks Debbie. Ethan Horn, thanks Ethan. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift than a recurring monthly contribution, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should also check out my side projects, The Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding and Dana Cole, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch-along stream Dana and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now, for next month's Regulation Trek Actually topic, we've met so many memorable characters in Star Trek over the years, and many of those characters have endured great suffering because pain and tragedy are dependable engines of story. There's one particular character, though, who has been through so much that he's become the mascot of suffering in Star Trek. I think you know who I mean. But the question is, does this character really deserve to be the franchise's embodiment of suffering? Is there anyone else who has suffered more? In next month's Trek Actually video, I will attempt to answer the question, is Chief O'Brien actually Star Trek's most suffering character? That's next month. I'll be back then and a bunch of times before then, so until the next time you see me, whenever that is, thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.